topic tonight is Sericea Lespedeza. The original speaker was going to be Dr. Tom Terrill from Fort Valley State University. Dr. Terrill had to be out of town unexpectedly. So Dr. Niki Whitley is going to give this presentation. She's very familiar with the topic. She's very familiar with the research that Dr. Terrill has done. You're free to ask questions in the chat box. I'm going to jot down the questions and I'm going to ask them to Dr. Whitley at the end of the presentation. If there's some simple questions that I feel comfortable answering or something else, I will go ahead and answer in the chat box, but for the most part, we're going to save the questions for the end. In case you weren't here when Nikki was reading her background, Nikki is an animal science specialist at Fort Valley State University. She's been there since last summer. Prior to that, she was at North Carolina A&T University. She was a program leader in extension there and also a small ruminant specialist. Prior to that, she was here in Maryland at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. She's really the one that started the small ruminant program at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. So she was there for a number of years, and as I said, she's a member of the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control, so she's very knowledgeable about this topic. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone and turn the program over to Dr. Whitley.
Thank you, Susan. So, as everyone's aware, I'm not Dr. Terrill, but as Susan pointed out, if you've seen the pictures, I do have more hair than Tom. Not a whole lot more, but I do have more hair than Tom. So we're going to talk about Sericea Lespedeza and some of the things that it can be used for. So we asked the question, can it be used as a soil builder? And the answer, yes. Can it be used as a cost-effective source of hay? Check. That's a yes, too. Can we use it as a feed resource for different classes and species of livestock? Yes, and we'll talk more about that. It is also used as a nutraceutical and as part of a sustainable parasite management program, as well as because of these other things that it's used for as a potential source of revenue. To remember, I have to click the button to change it. So Sericea Lespedeza is native to Australasia or Eastern Asia and Australia. However, it can be grown in the U.S. and is grown in many parts of the U.S. The top picture here is a preliminary map of where Sericea Lespedeza could be planted and could thrive based on soil types. And with the red colors being more conducive to the type of soils that Sericea might grow in. When you look at where Sericea is actually grown in the U.S., there's quite a bit of it here in the states listed, but most of it is in this region, kind of the southeastern region. And a little bit more is growing in Florida as we see some climate change also in other areas of the U.S. I saw someone in the chat box mentioned they had tried to grow it. I tried to grow it in Maryland and didn't have much luck growing it there, but it does grow there. The land that I had it on was very wet, and Sericea Lespedeza doesn't really like wet feet. So, and there are some tricks to establishment, which we'll talk about when we go through the presentation. So, in the world, these are some of the main areas where Sericea Lespedeza is found. Of course, where it's native, and then in the U.S., and as well as in South Africa. When you look at the history of Sericea Lespedeza in the United States, it was first introduced at one of the North Carolina experiment stations in 1896, but at that time there wasn't a whole lot of interest in it. And it wasn't until the 1920s that there was beginning to get a lot more interest and primarily as a use in soil conservation, although also as a forage. In the 30s and up through the 50s, it was widely used along road banks and in areas where soil erosion was an issue, and in places where soil improvement was needed. Some of those earlier cultivars were very fibrous, and they do contain, all the cultivars contain condensed tannins or tannins. And some of these earlier cultivars were so fibrous that there were palatability problems. The animals didn't really want to eat it, and there were some digestibility issues. But improvements have been made as time went on. Sericea and Interstate are two high condensed tannin versions of Sericea Lespedeza that are fairly common. AU low tan, developed in 1980, and AU Donnelly in 1987, developed at Auburn University, that's the AU, are some low tannin varieties, and AU low tan is particularly grown in South Africa, and we have some research to present about some of the uses of it in South Africa. What's been researched the most with our group and in small ruminants has been AU Grazer, which was developed by Jorge Mojices in Auburn University in 1997. And it is the primary variety and really the only grazing tolerant variety of Sericea Lespedeza. Some of these earlier varieties, they were very stemmy, and a lot of the leaves were located at the top of the plant because it loses the leaf quite easily, which is good for soil building and it adds organic matter to the soil, but it's not good for grazing in that if the top leaves are grazed off, the animals can overgraze it and kill it. So AU Grazer was developed as a moderate condensed tannin version of a grazing tolerant Sericea Lespedeza. So again, some of those older cultivars are used today even for stabilizing soils in areas that have disturbed or eroding sites like surface mine coal sites and road banks, which we already talked about some, but also improving wildlife habitats. In addition, there's a lot of common Sericea Lespedeza that's grown in the Midwest, that's just growing in the Midwestern states and is used as a forage, although in some states it is considered an invasive species, and in Colorado and Kansas, I believe it's actually considered a noxious weed, but has a lot of benefits that we're going to talk about. But again, AU Grazer is the primary cultivar that is planted for grazing, and it's a hay crop. Although there are some annual Lespedezas, Sericea Lespedeza varieties, all of the Sericea Lespedezas are perennials. Some of the agronomic advantages of Sericea Lespedeza includes that it grows on a wide range of soil types, as you've seen by looking at where it does grow in the U.S. And it does grow well in Canada and parts of Canada. It can tolerate acidic soils and infertile sites because it is a legume. It fixes nitrogen, and so it really doesn't need nitrogen fertilization. And in all actuality, you would likely be wasting your money if you did use nitrogen fertilizer. It is real deep rooting, so it can go, some varieties, it will go below the acid plane so that it gets down deep into where there's more water, so it's drought tolerant, and it reduces the need for phosphorus fertilization. The tannins help it to be insect resistant, and it has minimal disease problems. And again, that tendency to shed the lower leaves will help improve organic matter in the soil and soil fertility, and the deep rooting helps to reduce soil erosion. So Sericea Lespedeza, some of the forms that it's used in, we talked a little bit about grazing as a fresh forage, and then also as a hay, and then the hay can be pelleted, and then silage can be made. So for hay production, Sericea Lespedeza will make 3 to 4 tons of hay per acre, or it has in Georgia. And in Alabama, in the 70s and 80s, some research found up to 5.5 tons per acre. And then Sims Brothers, who we work with in the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Control, they actually were the developers of the Sericea Lespedeza leaf meal pellet, and they've reported up to 2 tons per acre of just leaf meal, which is basically the leaf from the hay that they harvest for pelleting. And then the seed yield of Sericea Lespedeza is 200 to 400 pounds per acre. As far as a nutritional or a forage or feeding substance, older cultivars, which we already talked about a little bit, had these thick woody stems that had reduced nutritional value. The high tannin cultivars were then developed with finer stems, but they still had the tannin. And some of the early work indicated, or some of the early observations, people would say that it was both the fiber and the tannin that reduced the intake of Sericea Lespedeza by livestock. And as they developed some of these high condensed tannin cultivars with the finer stems, they realized that it was mostly that real fibrous stem, that thick woody stem, that was causing the reduced intake. So again, the digestibility of the reduced intake and digestibility was really more so due to the fiber than the condensed tannins. So they also found that sun drying of the high condensed tannin improved intake and digestibility, and that low condensed tannin cultivars that were developed did have higher digestibility. So the condensed tannins do have protein binding effects, and so that may also impact digestibility. So some of the grazing studies, when cattle graze common Sericea Lespedeza, they tend to graze that top 7 to 8 inches of the mature stand. They like those younger leaves and the thinner stems. And that condensed tannin is just as high in the young plants as it is in the mature stands. So they get the benefit of the tannins as well. Though it is recommended to start grazing when the plants are 8 inches tall, because when they graze any more than that, especially with the older types of Sericea Lespedeza, again, we were talking about how it could thin out that stand or even kill that stand. And then, of course, again, the grazing tolerant cultivar was released by Auburn that would stand up to grazing a lot better. So Sericea has adequate nutrition both as a pasture and a hay crop for beef, cows, and calves, with research showing that it has performance similar to Bermuda grass, which in our area is what Dr. Terrill calls our control, because it's a warm season legume. Bermuda grass is the warm season grass that grows the best in our area. So a lot of times when he's doing his studies, he will use the Bermuda grass as the control for the Sericea Lespedeza. It's not recommended to graze growing calves on the high condensed tannin Sericea Lespedeza, at least just that as 100% of their diet. Cattle and sheep have been successfully grazed on the low tannin variety in South Africa, and we've seen that hay and pelleted Sericea Lespedeza is readily consumed by all classes of livestock. We fed it to cattle, sheep, goats, horses, llamas, and even exotic hoofstock in zoos. So again, livestock such as goats will readily graze Sericea Lespedeza, even the high condensed tannin varieties. Sheep in our studies, especially those in Arkansas, the USDA studies, they showed that sheep tended to need a little bit more of an adjustment period to learn to graze Sericea Lespedeza, but they definitely would. And Tom tells a story of a producer who was upset that his cattle weren't grazing the Sericea Lespedeza that was planted, and he had just shut them off in the field of Sericea Lespedeza, and they were standing at the gate, and he called and said, "What do I do?" And his contact said, "Well, just open the gate and let them choose." And after a day or two, they came right back, and then they were grazing the Sericea Lespedeza readily. So it may take an adjustment period, but they do then readily graze it. It does have adequate nutrition for mature animals for does and ewes, likely in the early pregnancy and when they're dry. In late lactation or in late gestation and lactation, of course, they will likely need energy supplementation and maybe even protein supplementation. But it does have adequate nutrition for many different animals and in different production stages. It has been shown to be good as a short-term feed for weaned lambs and kids. There was some indication, again, in some of the work in Arkansas and Louisiana that if it was their sole or high percentage of their diet, Sericea Lespedeza lambs would grow faster than control animals, but then they may drop off and actually have lower growth rate than animals grazing other forages. And so that kind of led to that recommendation of no more than 8 weeks if that is their sole or primary source of nutrition. And so again, that was in a 8 to 10 week period, you should be okay. Or if you're supplementing with other forages or with some other feed sources. So this was a study in Alabama. For 49 days, steers were fed Sericea Lespedeza or Bermuda grass and were supplemented. This was hay, and they were supplemented with soy hulls, and basically they had similar rates of gain, but they had lower intake of the hay, and so they gained the same, but they ate less. So it would likely be add to the profitability of that system. In South Africa, I alluded to earlier that there were some studies in South Africa using the AU low-tan, and they used the Sericea Lespedeza hay compared with a fertilized grass hay. And they used Eragrostis, which is teff, which some of you may have heard of. It is an annual here, but there it is. It's a perennial. And love grass, and there's a wide variety of love grasses, and those are all types of Eragrostes. So they compared these two in a 6-week trial with beef cows, and then in a 6-week study with dairy cows. And basically they found similar weight gain in the beef cows, and the milk volume, the butter fat, and the protein were all the same when they used it in dairy cows. And the kicker is that the Sericea Lespedeza hay is 60% cheaper than the Eragrostes hay. So again, a profitable and nutritious source of feed. Similar results were found with goats here at Fort Valley. Animals that were either parasitized or not, so infected with parasites or non-infected, and fed either Sericea Lespedeza, and this would be AU grazer, or Bermuda grass hay. Whether they were infected or not, the Sericea Lespedeza fed animals grew faster than the Bermuda grass fed animals. So in those studies with the goats, we also found anti-parasitic effects. So it has health benefits for livestock as well. It lowers fecal egg counts for the gastrointestinal nematodes like Homunculus contortus we were talking about earlier, the barber pole worm. That is a big problem in sheep and goats and other small ruminants, including reindeer apparently. Which is not a small ruminant, but it also reduces the eggs or OCS counts for Coccidia, which is not a worm but is a parasite that does cause problems in small ruminants and other ruminants as well. It is anti-bloat, meaning that some legumes like alfalfa, if grazed, can cause bloat, but Sericea Lespedeza does not because of the tannins. And benefit to dairy producers is that it reduces somatic cell count in goat milk. And that's important because if somatic cell count reaches over 1.5 million, you can't sell the milk. And so a natural product that could reduce somatic cell count would be beneficial to the industry. Okay, so there are several different medical uses or nutraceutical type uses of Sericea Lespedeza, and these are some that were listed in a book that Sericea Lespedeza has been used to treat these types of conditions in China for many years. And one that's really intriguing to us is the use of it to treat ascarids or roundworms in people. And so livestock can get some of the gastrointestinal nematodes we were talking about are roundworms, specifically ascarids. Pigs can get ascarids, and so there's been some interest in trying to look at if Sericea Lespedeza could help treat ascarids in pigs. It's an issue primarily in pasture-based pig production, and as that gets more popular, it could be a natural use for Sericea Lespedeza as a potential dewormer. Some other benefits in some research studies, Sericea Lespedeza lowered ruminal methane production, which is significant in that methane is the second most important greenhouse gas that impacts climate, and reduced urinary losses of nitrogen as urea. So especially in concentrated feeding operations like cattle feedlots, where a lot of urine may build up, and you'd have a lot of ammonia if you could feed a product that reduced that, then that will be beneficial to the environment, and also in pasture-based systems, a less chance of increased nutrient loading of nitrogen. So it also had some antibacterial effects on, and may have reduced E. coli, or seems to have reduced E. coli, and some preliminary evidence here on goat meat. So it may have some benefit in food safety as well. And in some studies recently with cattle, Sericea Lespedeza fed actually killed houseflies, reduced the number of larvae, fly larvae in the manure. So one of the benefits that, some of these benefits that we're talking about, Sericea Lespedeza has, may be in part due to, or in a good part due to, the condensed tannins that they contain. So tannins are polyphenolic compounds that accumulate in the cells of the leaves and the stems. And condensed tannins, especially those in Sericea Lespedeza, have a high concentration of prodelphinidin type tannins, or the PD type, which I told Tom, I'm just going to call it the good tannins. And so the good tannins are, these PD types are very reactive with protein, which can be of a benefit, as we'll see, and then may have some negative impacts if it's overly reactive and binds too much plant and feed proteins. So when you look at tannins in Sericea Lespedeza, the concentration differs in the different parts of the plant, with the leaves having the highest proportion or concentration of tannins, and the stems having much less. When the pellets were analyzed that are whole plant pellets, they still have a fairly high concentration of the condensed tannins. And then when you look at the structure or the type of tannins in them, the leaves are 99% of the good tannin, the PD type, and 94% in the stems, and 97% in the pellets. And so, again, a high percentage of that reactive type protein. And this measurement, MDPs, is basically, again, just a measurement of how reactive that is. There are other forages that have condensed tannins. Bird's foot trefoil has 1 to 5%. Big trefoil, 5 to 10%. Sericea Lespedeza, again, 6 to 13%. And then canary clover. But it varies in composition, that type of tannins that it has. And bird's foot trefoil, for example, has a low PD to PC ratio, so it's low reactivity, so it has low protein binding. And then Sericea Lespedeza condensed tannins has the high PD to PC ratio, so a high amount of the good tannins that have a high reactivity to protein. And so basically we say that all tannins are not created equal. So even if it has tannins, the type or composition of those tannins or ratios is also important. Dr. Terrill has a study right now looking at different accessions or cultivars of Sericea Lespedeza and looking at their structure, condensed tannin structure and ratios. And he's got some really interesting results he said he's going to share soon, we hope. So the condensed tannin concentration and composition also varies, like, you know, I was just letting you guys know that it varies with cultivar, and he's looking at some of that research now. It varies with the plant part, like we've seen earlier, the leaves versus the stem, and with plant maturity, whether it's in the leafy growth stage, or it's in that reproductive growth mature stage. And then with processing method, the composition and the structure of the condensed tannins can change. So sun curing for hay can bind a little bit more of the proteins. Grinding and pelleting, again, through that heat process, you may see more bound tannin than you do free. And then in the ensiling process could change the concentration or composition. So we talked about a little bit of the health benefits, and one of those being anti-parasitic effects. And so that is in part due to their ability to form complexes with both plant and parasite proteins. And so it will bind plant proteins, but it also binds proteins on the parasite. And so the mechanism of action of the Sericea Lespedeza might be explained by both indirect and direct effects. And one of the indirect effects would be that binding of the condensed tannins to the protein in the plant itself and in the feed, if it's fed with other feeds, and then makes almost like a bypass protein. And so it binds it so that it's not digested early in the digestive tract and can bypass, for example, the rumen, because of the pH in the rumen and how the pH in the rumen is different from the pH in the rest of the tract. And it allows for that protein to go through and be digested and absorbed later in the tract, and may get more protein digested through that action. And there may be other indirect effects, but that was one proposed effect that hasn't been proven. But there's also direct effects. So those tannins can bind the proteins on the actual parasite. And with some scanning electron microscopy, we've actually seen that those tannins can bind the proteins on the sheath of the outer sheath of the larva or on the worm, and may bind, for example, around the mouth or around the egg-laying orifice, so that fecal egg counts are reduced and they aren't able to eat as effectively. And also just a general unhealthy appearance has been found when looking up close in some of these larvae and worms from animals fed Sericea Lespedeza. So it might also have the direct effect on the worm itself. So in grazing trials with Sericea Lespedeza, so we talked a little bit about the nutritional aspects of feeding Lespedeza. Now we're going to talk about the health effects. And so with grazing, a 50% reduction was found in fecal egg counts for those that were grazing Sericea Lespedeza compared to tall fescue. And lower numbers of actual adult worms have also been found in goat kids that were grazing, and this was for homuncus or barber pole worm, which is the one that causes anemia and death in sheep and goats, the brown stomach worm, as well as the bankrupt worm or black scour worm, Trichostrongylus. So it does have an effect both on fecal egg counts and has been shown to have an effect on number of adult worms. And then in kids grazing Sericea Lespedeza alone or Sericea Lespedeza Bermuda grass mixed compared to just Bermuda grass, there was a reduction in fecal egg counts of 95 for the Sericea Lespedeza and 71% for the Sericea Bermuda grass combination when compared just with the Bermuda grass pasture. So again, it does have those anti-parasitic effects. When we look at use of grazing Sericea Lespedeza, it has been effective at different locations. in the U.S., in North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas, in South Africa, and with different animal species, breeds, and ages, including pre-weaned and weanling lambs, weaned and weaned kids, 3 to 12 months of age, and then Spanish and Boer cross type goats. Different Lespedeza cultivars that have been used have been AU Grazer and AU Lotan in South Africa. And then there are some other cultivars that may be effective as well that are not yet tested. And I will say that I know producers in North Carolina that were grazing unknown perennial varieties of Sericea Lespedeza and swore by it. They said, I never have to, I hardly ever have to deworm my Boer cross goats anymore now that I have this big pasture of Sericea Lespedeza. And they knew it was not AU Grazer, but they did not know what cultivar it was. So, grazing Lespedeza, because it's limited to the late spring, summer, early autumn, depending on where you're at, because it is a warm season plant. Because it's limited, we want to look at some different methods that we could process it and move it to different parts of the U.S. and so, or the country, internationally. So, we've looked at ensiling it or sun drying it or processing it into leaf meal or pellets. And so, sun drying, making it as hay, and leaf meal and pellets, again, fairly easy to do. And it gives farmers flexibility to use it on farm where it may not grow. It also makes it easier to store and transport it. And although it does have this, it may reduce the extractable condensed tannin, which would basically, because it increases the condensed tannin bound to protein. So anytime that you increase heating of the plant, it increases the condensed tannins that bind to the protein within the plant and may not be available to bind to the parasite for a direct effect, and may or may not be loosened within the digestive tract to allow for that bypass protein effect, depending on how strongly that binding occurs. So the question is, again, Dr. Terrill was thinking that we wanted to determine what, if any, of these processes might influence negatively its anti-parasitic process properties. And so when he did some studies on feeding Sericea Lespedeza hay and looking at fecal egg counts in goats, you can see that it was quite effective as a hay. And so sun drying did not seem to even though it may have bound some of the protein in the Sericea Lespedeza, or the condensed tannins may have bound protein in the hay because of the heat process and drying process, it still had that anti-parasitic effect in the animal. It also had a direct effect on the number of larvae in the feces compared to Bermuda grass hay. And so, again, the percentage of the worms that'll be in the animal and then passing eggs on to the field was also reduced. So it doesn't just have an effect on homuncus. He's looked at specific species, and although it does have, as you can see, quite a pronounced effect on homuncus or barber pole worm, it does still have a significant reduction, or it did in this study, on adult worm species in the bankrupt or black scour worm and the brown stomach worm. The ground Sericea Lespedeza, and then the ground Lespedeza that was pelleted also both reduced fecal egg counts compared to the ground Bermuda grass control when fed to goats. Earlier summer 2015, in summer 2015, Dr. Terrill conducted a study here looking at Bermuda grass as the control hay and Sericea Lespedeza hay along with the silage. So he was trying to determine if the heat process involved within siling would negatively impact the condensed tannins in that, or bind too many of them and negate that effect on fecal egg count that we've seen with grazing and with hay. And as you can see on the graph, it did not. Both the silage and the hay reduced fecal egg counts compared to the control. He indicated that it took a little while longer for the goats to start eating the Sericea Lespedeza as readily as they did the hay, but that when they started eating it as readily as they did the hay, that's when he really saw the reductions. And I saw this as well when I started here in the fall. We conducted a study very similar to this one in that we looked at Sericea Lespedeza and silage. We were also looking at trying to negate the effects of tannin by feeding polyethylene glycol, which will bind the tannins. So you could tell if it was the tannins doing the having an effect directly on the worms, or if there was more of an indirect action. And so we weren't able to get the peg in doses that we needed to, but we did see, again, that both Sericea Lespedeza hay and silage were readily eaten by the goats and were effective in reducing fecal egg counts as well as Coccidia OCS counts. So help control gastrointestinal nematodes or worms as well as Coccidia. So with hay trials, we've seen it effective in goats at Fort Valley State University as well as at the USDA in Arkansas. With sheep at LSU and again in Arkansas, and with cattle at LSU and llamas at Fort Valley State University. When the Sericea Lespedeza pellets were tested, there was a positive effect or that reduced gastrointestinal nematodes or measures of that in sheep, goats, and beef cattle. And I conducted one of those studies at North Carolina A&T State University. And although it's not 100% every time effective, which we'll talk about in a little while, it has been found effective for the most part in many cases. And then again, also with Coccidia in both sheep and goats, and fecal egg counts in beef cattle were reduced at Fort Valley State in a small study as well. So, drying and processing Lespedeza, the bottom line was it didn't reduce its anti-parasitic effectiveness overall. There may be some special cases in which it may, if it is overheated. So if in the pelleting process the Sericea Lespedeza gets extremely overheated, I found in a study that it did lose its anti-parasitic effects, but it was very apparent that it had gotten overheated. The pellets looked burnt. They were very dark brown, and they were supposed to be a nice green color. And so this this was a pelleting process that was done locally at a local university for me to test at A&T, and the feed mill there got in a hurry and tried to push it through too fast, and everything got overheated, and I think they burnt it. So that's one of the cases where it did not have anti-parasitic effects, but through no fault of its own, I would not believe. So some other questions that came up as we were doing these studies included how much is needed to have an anti-parasitic effect? What parasites is it most effective against? And does it always work? Which I just addressed some of that with the overheating situation. And so dose titration studies were undergone to try to determine basically at what percentage of the diet would Sericea Lespedeza be effective. And so in these studies, whole plant Sericea Lespedeza hay was provided at 0, 25, 50, or 75% of the diet. And the 50% and 75% of the diet decreased fecal egg count. And in other studies, even 25% of the diet when feeding whole plant and leaf only Sericea Lespedeza meal also decreased fecal egg counts in, I believe this was goats. So it's also been found to reduce the number of adult females of different worm species. So it reduced, feeding Sericea Lespedeza reduced Homunculus contortus or barber pole worm adult female numbers by 77%. And again, the bankrupt worm or black scour worm by 50%, and brown stomach worm by 36%. So it does have an effect also on the adults. And this is a picture of an adult worm, specifically barber pole. This is our troublemaker here, but there are others. And Coccidia is one of the parasites that also causes us problems. And Sericea Lespedeza dramatically, and this is a pretty dramatic decrease, Coccidia oocysts in goats, where it remained lower for the Sericea Lespedeza, and really, I guess this shouldn't be decreased, but maintained low levels of oocysts when compared to the Bermuda grass-fed animals. And this shows the ability of both the hay and the silage to reduce the Coccidia egg counts or oocyst counts as well when compared to your control treatment. And again, this was in goats, and I believe this was part of that summer 2015 trial. And although I don't have a graph for it, and that is my fault, but Dr. Terrill has asked me to do that. Actually, maybe I did do one for him, but we didn't put it in here anyway. So it also decreased fecal egg counts and Coccidia counts. So in general, the overall anti-parasitic effectiveness of Sericea Lespedeza has been consistent in goats in Georgia. It's been consistent with sheep in Louisiana, but we've had some variable results with sheep and goats in Arkansas and North Carolina. And again, with the goats in North Carolina, I believe it was primarily due to the overcooking, if you will, of the pellets. In Arkansas, there may be some differences in how Sericea Lespedeza impacts the fecal or the parasite at different infection levels. So if there's a extremely high level of Homunculus contortus that it may require some additional treatment, not just using Sericea Lespedeza. And again, I explained some of the overheating of the pellets, and then it was theorized that there may be possible differences actually in the parasite itself. So the genetics of the parasite, it's all homunculus, but definitely there could be a different homunculus in Arkansas than is in Georgia. So some of the recommendations for use of Sericea Lespedeza feeding, at least as it pertains to parasite management. So we found it can be fed fresh. So like you could graze it or you could do cut and carry. It can be fed dried in hay form, in leaf meal form, or as pellets. And the pellets and also the seed can be found at Sims Brothers, and Sims Brothers actually has a couple of outlets that they sell wholesale to, and then it's resold, and I can't remember where, but if you email me, I'll look it up. Or if you can contact them. And it can be preserved in the ensiling process to make silage. And the chaff hay is that you can buy in the store, which is a plastic wrapped, basically alfalfa silage bale. So if someone were business minded enough to perhaps develop a chaff hay type product based on Sericea Lespedeza, that might be a revenue source in itself. And then we suggest that it be 25% or more of the diet. 50% or more of the diet, although in one study that concentrated leaf meal at 25% was effective. But again, overall we recommend 50% or more of the diet. But again, not as the sole or high percentage, 80 to 90% of the diet for longer than 8 to 10 weeks. And then, of course, you will need to supplement energy or protein to meet the needs of specific classes of animals or in a specific production phase. So for control of Coccidia and or barber pole worm, it's been suggested to start feeding the Sericea Lespedeza product 2 weeks prior to, and then 6 weeks after any period of stress, such as weaning. And then specifically for susceptible animals, again at weaning, and then dose and use during kidding and lambing or in early lactation, particularly with twins or triplets, and they have a lot of production stress on them. Again, the recommendation currently stands that it's no longer than 8 weeks at a time, especially with young kids and lambs, if it's a great percentage of their diet, because of possible binding of trace minerals in some locations and farms. And that was primarily in Arkansas. And it did reduce some of our trace minerals, but not to a level of a deficit. But they saw a little bit of a reduction of growth, and they couldn't explain if it was due to the trace minerals or not. But a replacement of the trace minerals didn't really impact the mineral status of the animal. So they're still not exactly sure the exact mechanism of that. And again, I believe it was only in Arkansas that's been found, maybe in Louisiana. But it's still enough to cause us to hesitate recommending feeding 100% of the diet as Sericea Lespedeza, or 80 to 95 even longer than 8 weeks at a time. Although it doesn't seem to be a problem with older animals as far as feeding them for longer. overall, we just want to remember that it's not a silver bullet, and that it needs to be used as part of an integrated parasite control program. There are other techniques you can, or there's other things you can use. You want to use FOMACHA, or the eyelid color scoring, procedure. There are copper oxide wire particles, which are a natural deworming product that actually does work effectively. And then there are other techniques, use of browse for goats, and managing your pastures to maintain cleaner pastures as far as parasite infestations, and also managing your stocking rates and other things that you can get on our website at wormex.info, or the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. And you can also maybe find some training in your area to get FOMACHA certified and to learn more integrated parasite control methods. Some of the future research that could be done as far as Sericea Lespedeza and using it for parasite control. Grazing trials with sheep and goats, again in pure stands, in combination with other forages. How much, what types of forages could it grow with? Use of Sericea Lespedeza as a deworming paddock to try to get at that how much do we need kind of thing. And then research with Sericea Lespedeza as dried or ensiled feeds, has an ingredient in complete feeds, which some of the pellets that we've developed could be used as a complete feed. Pasture supplement, a component of a total mixed ration for feedlot or confinement feeding. I've had a producer here in Georgia that's interested in grinding. He produces a lot of Sericea Lespedeza hay and feeds, so he can feed Sericea year round, and he wants to grind it and make TMRs specifically for his different production levels of his sheep business. And then use of it in beef and dairy cattle, dairy goats, llamas and alpacas, pigs, poultry, and even zoo animals. And some of the zoo animal work, they're especially interested in being able to use Sericea Lespedeza specifically in pellet form. So, establishment of Sericea Lespedeza for organic or grass-fed small ruminant production is something that's of interest. And then on-farm trials, using, again, grazing hay, pellet, silage, to look at its effectiveness on farm in different combinations with other technologies. So, can Sericea Lespedeza be a potential source of additional revenue? And it is currently, the pellets are currently being marketed as an anthelmintic feed, and one of the drawbacks is being able to produce enough leaf meal, because the pellets are just the leaf. And the Sims brothers developed a harvesting technique, developed their own harvester modified one to be able to harvest the leaf meal pellets effectively to pellet. But there are still times when there's just not enough leaf meal to make the pellets that they need. And then looking at if it can be ensiled in small batches, kind of like the chaff hay packages I was talking about. And then how can it be used as a feed resource for organic livestock production? Here's the contact information for the Sims brothers. They do have seed and leaf meal pellets of AU Grazer. And again, they can tell you the two outlets that they sell to that might be able to sell you product. They will sell individual bags. They said they will sell on small scale, but the shipping fees are more efficient if you more reasonable if you buy in bulk, of course. So for establishment, you want to plant it on upland soil that's well drained. Again, I mentioned that in Maryland we had some wet soils and it doesn't really like wet feet. And then fertilizing lime according to the soil test. You want to broadcast it. You don't really want to drill it. You can broadcast and use the cultipacker. You want it to be on a firm seed bed, and again, when it's warm in the spring, and you're not going to get a frost. And then it takes a little while to come up, so it's not a fast germinator, and so weed control is important, and you want to try to control those. You only plant it at 1/4 inch, and so you don't really you can use a drill, but you may get better excuse me, you may get a better stand if you just broadcast it and use a cultipacker. And then if you don't use a herbicide, you need to plant more per acre than if you do. And this is an example of a drill, and then the cultipacker system that really works well for planting it. So again, it's not a fast germinator, and it doesn't grow really fast initially as it comes on. It does need some regular moisture after it's germinated, but it is drought tolerant after that. Once it gets established, you don't want to graze it during that first establishment year, but you can cut it for hay if you have enough growth later on in the season. And then you can graze it because in year 2, the second year after establishment, because it usually thickens up by then. If you're going to cut it for hay, usually wait till it's 15 to 20 inches tall. It's amazingly dry. We tried to use some we tried to use a juicer to try to get some juice out of it, to use the extract to try to use it like as a drench, and to use it for our meat studies as to swipe it on meat as a as a control method for bacterial growth, as a little experiment. And it took a heavy duty major juicer to be able to get the juice out of it. So it dries very rapidly. It's a like I said, an amazingly dry plant, and so it dries very rapidly. But if you can use a hay conditioner, if you have one, you can use it to crush the stems. That will help. And you can actually graze it the first day and then bale it the next day after the dew dries off. I mean, within 24 hours, you could be baling it, depending on the weather, of course, and the humidity and in your area. If you're going to graze it, again, you want to wait until the plants are 6 to 8 inches tall, and then rotationally graze so that you maintain enough root carbohydrate reserves, basically so you don't kill off the plant. And again, as I described, those older cultivars that drop their leaves off the bottom, much easier or less grazing tolerant, with AU Grazer being the only one that's really grazing tolerant. And what's the potential for increased use of Sericea Lespedeza? Tom says it's the world. Sericea Lespedeza is going to take over the world. And thank you. And this is a picture of Tom undergoing FOMACHA, Dr. Terrill undergoing a FOMACHA test.
He looks so much younger in that picture.
He does. Look at Adriano. He's really young.
Okay, I've been writing down questions as you've been giving your presentation, and I'm going to ask the questions now. Some of them you may already have addressed. In some cases, I may just ask you to address them again just to make sure people got the answer. One of them is somebody was asking if low tan was the designation for low tannin.
It is it is just a name that they developed because it is low tannin, because AU Donnelly is also low tannin. So AU low tan was the cute name that they made up to designate that it is low tannin, but it's not the only low tannin variety or cultivar.
There were quite a few questions about growing Sericea Lespedeza with other species, with other grasses. Even somebody asked a question about planting it with alfalfa. And they wanted to know if, is it a monoculture or can it be grown with other plants?
Okay, so it was grown with Bermuda grass here, so they actually seeded it together. Obviously, if you're going to grow it with others, it would need to be, well, I don't say obviously, but, I know that it doesn't have to be grown as a monoculture. Now, whether it can be grown with specific plants, that would have to be, I really don't know. Tom may could answer, or any plant science or forage person might be able to answer. I mean, if it's planted with alfalfa, I guess it would depend on where you're at, as far as how well alfalfa grows. Because like here, we couldn't plant it with alfalfa because alfalfa doesn't grow very well here. It's actually considered the poor man's alfalfa because it grows in places and it's cheaper and drought tolerant than alfalfa is. So I would say that if you wanted to mix it to kind of get with your growing guide, get a growing guide and look at when they're planted. And obviously, alfalfa can be grown with other species, with mixed grasses, and Sericea Lespedeza can. So I don't see why you wouldn't be able to, except the growing season differences, because alfalfa tends to grow more in the cooler parts of the season.
How deep are the roots of Sericea Lespedeza?
So there was one study that looked at a cultivar that grew 3 feet down. So I'm not sure if that's the maximum, but I definitely know they can go at least 3 feet.
Does Sericea self-seed?
So it is a perennial. So and it does seed, so I'm assuming the answer to that is yes, if that's what they mean by self-seed.
And I think you answered this one, but the cutting height, if you made into hay, I think, if I remember the slide correctly, was that 15 to 20 inches?
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay, there it is. There's the slide.
Well, that says when it's 15 to 20 inches tall, but I wouldn't cut it. Yeah, so I think that they're asking like how much to leave left, and if you don't want to graze it less than 8 inches, I would guess that you might not want to cut it less than 8 inches. So I don't know if, so there's 2 different answers that hopefully one of those was what they were looking for.
If the person asking the question would want to clarify that, they can type that in the chat box. Okay, any concern with high condensed tannins acting as an antagonist?
Yes, high condensed tannins, again, not necessarily an antagonist, but they do bind protein. So there can be cases where it binds too much protein. And so initially, and it's more of the hydrolyzable tannins are considered bad tannins than the condensed tannins, but there can be negative effects of binding protein. So, for example, the anti-parasitic effects of the condensed tannins, when the condensed tannins bound all the protein, in the plant, those anti-parasitic effects weren't seen anymore. So if condensed tannins in Sericea Lespedeza were fed with other high proteins, there could be, but again, this is what we've seen so far.
Getting back to the question about at what height to cut it for hay, she's asking if she grazes it at 8 inches but cuts it for hay at 15 to 20.
So I believe what he's trying to say is when it's 15 to 20 inches tall, cut it for hay down to no more than 8 inches. Does that make sense? I believe that's what that means, but I can confirm with Tom.
Do you know if Sericea Lespedeza has any effect on dung beetles?
I don't.
Okay, we could address that question to Tom.
Yes.
I will put his email back up there.
Or an entomologist. That's
done for tonight.
That's interesting.
I think one of the first studies you presented the data on, there was a question right after that, and they think this was the goats were grazing Sericea Lespedeza and Bermuda grass, and they were infected and uninfected with parasites, and somebody asked how much Sericea Lespedeza did the goats receive.
He was saying,
do you recall that one?
Yeah, I asked him that, and I think he told me 75% of the diet.
Okay. I have a question. How does sun curing bind protein?
It will be the heat. It's the heat that causes the tannins to bind the protein.
And what's the impact of polyethylene glycol on binding protein?
Okay. So polyethylene glycol actually, I'm not exactly sure exactly, but it basically deactivates tannin. So it binds the tannin or modifies the tannin so it can't bind the protein. So basically it modifies the tannin so you can say, it basically allows you to feed Sericea Lespedeza and take away the tannin effect so you could determine if it was the tannin directly impacting the fecal egg counts.
Somebody wanted to know if it was available as a cube, I guess instead of pellets.
So I don't know anybody that's cubing it. It could be just like they have alfalfa cubes and alfalfa pellets. Again, a source of Sericea Lespedeza and an entrepreneurial spirit would be great to be able to allow for a variety of products to be available for us in a lot of areas.
Because one of the questions, of course, is can you buy AU Grazer? And I went back to this slide. This is the place that you get it, or that provides it for distribution.
Right, and AU Grazer, I think there are other places that sell the seed. It's just, I think Sims Brothers is the primary point of contact, and Sims Brothers, I believe, has a patent on the leaf meal pellet. So I believe, but at least they have a patent for the use of it as for parasite control, but they can't label it for parasite control because that hadn't been tested, but they have a patent for that. But really, they don't have a patent on the actual pellet itself because you can't really patent that. That process has been done for a long time. So anybody that can develop pellets should be able to do the pellet process or make cubes, or like I said, the packages of silage like Chaffee comes in.
Is there any indication that parasites are adapting to it or becoming resistant to its effects on parasites?
And he had a slide in there about that. So as an animal eats tannin, so as the tannin as they as they eat tannin, as they're exposed to it for a length of time, they have changes in their saliva and changes in their rumen bacteria, so their digestive tract bacteria, that kind of allows them to adapt to the tannin somewhat. But there's never been any controlled studies that say if that negates or if that causes the tannins not to work on parasites anymore. So nobody's ever done that study. We know there are some changes, but again, nobody's ever done the study. And Tom wanted to, like Tom said, well, he wondered if that was, some of the reason that in Arkansas they didn't see an effect on some of the fecal egg counts in some of the studies. And I said, well, were the animals being fed Sericea Lespedeza for a long time before the study? And he said no. And I was like, well, then that can't be it, can it? And so that's why I took the slide out, because I think we need to do a controlled study to see if that would be effective. I see a question on frost seeded.
Have any of this stuff? You stay out of the chat box.
Okay.
Have any studies been done to pregnant ewes and does?
I think yes. I think I'm pretty sure what Joan Burke's done some, and it decreased fecal egg counts. They did late pregnant and early lactation because that's when the paraparturient rise happens. And so I'm pretty sure he didn't have it in here, but I remember Joan presenting some of that data.
Okay, there are a couple of questions about cultivation. Our friend from Norway asks when the best time to seed, and then we have a question from Alabama. Can it be frost?
Okay, so according to the slides that he gave us, he told us that you need to plant it when all danger of frost is gone. So I would say no to the frost seeding. And so the time of the year would be when it gets warm, and there's all danger of frost is gone. So it is a warm season plant, so it needs to be warm. In Bermuda grass, for example, it is also a warm season, and you're supposed to plant it when all chances of frost are gone. And so we say that when soil temperature is greater than 60 degrees, for example, and you're pretty sure that the frost is gone. So that the guidelines were when there's no danger of frost. So whenever that is in your area of the world.
So that kind of leads to another question from New York. Are there any tricks to get it to grow in the wet north? And again, this is from New York, and we have folks from PEI and Maine.
So,
any tricks?
I don't know. You would have to ask Tom, but I will say, like I said, I tried to plant it in Maryland on the Eastern Shore where it's wet, and it did not take. And I tried twice, and so I think it would be tricky to get it to grow. But maybe Tom's heard of some trick, has heard of some things, or has some tricks up his sleeves that may help.
We also tried to plant it in Western Maryland twice and didn't get a stand. From New York, another question: what type of inoculant should be used?
Oh yeah. I used to know. I don't remember. I would think that I was fixing to say the same you would use for alfalfa, but I'm not sure. I don't want to tell y'all wrong. We'll have to ask Tom that. I used to know because I had to use it, or I used it for Maryland.
Nikki's like me, she's an animal scientist, and I think she's done a super job with tonight's presentation. Tom is an agronomist, and he's dedicated his life to this, so we're really going to encourage you to ask some of these more specific questions, especially about cultivation, to Tom. I'm going to put his email address back up there. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions, and he may have some tricks. He's worked with people all over the world. Fort Valley got to focus on putting the right email. Nikki's at the right email?
Terrill T, yep.